trouser trouble. After nearly a month in town, I bought an old dog from a Maori I knew and put him and Flynn in the van when I boarded a train for Peoria, where Jim was to meet me. Got a real good winter block for you this time, Crumpy, he'd said on the phone. Right on the coast, with goats on the shoreline, and pigs back in the hills. Bring your dogs and you'll have the time of your life. All the fishing you want, and there's a boat you can use to go out to the Hapuku grounds on your days off. A real holiday block. There's a good keen man going in with you, too. You'll have your work cut out to beat this bloke. He's been hunting privately for years. Jim met me at the station and introduced me to Jock, the good keen man who was to be my mate for the winter. Jock had 3 dogs, and with my 2 and Jim's 4, we had 9 dogs plus all the supplies and gear stacked in the back of Jim's little truck. We left the township and drove along the coast road for hours, stopping only to quell an occasional uprising among the dogs, with a stick we carried in the cab. The road ended at a locked gate, which Jim opened, and we drove up to a board hut which stood in a windswept paddock. All your hunting is from here on, said Jim. You can use any huts you find in the bays along the coast, but leave the sheep and cattle alone. We don't want any trouble with the cockies. If you feel like a bit of beef or mutton, you can open a tin. Jim stayed with us for a few days, which was just as well because we found that most of the goats we shot on the cliffs fell into the sea, or in places where it was dangerous or impossible to retrieve their tails. He agreed to let us enter all the goats we killed in the book as OKs. That is, as animals you know are dead but can't get tokens from, and only keep the pigtails as proof of our tallies. It was an area where all the shooting was done on straight wages, so we had nothing to gain by slipping a few extra goats into the tally, a fact which Jim was very careful to point out to us. His years as a field officer hadn't left him with many delusions about shooters. Only a week after our arrival on the block, my new dog, a veteran of 5 years pig hunting, chased a billy goat round a ledge and got butted off the cliff face. He fell about 150 feet into the sea and presumably drowned. Jock's dogs were pretty young and inexperienced, so we ran Flynn with them after that. He knew most of the tricks of the trade, but wasn't much good on his own. We took it in turns to take the dogs after pigs in the bush, and to shoot goats on the coast, not wanting the dogs working close to the cliffs, where it was too easy for them to get into trouble. The loss of one experienced dog was already more than we could afford. The tallies were shared evenly between us, and it worked out square. Jock pulled his weight with the cooking too, though he was a bit heavy-handed with curry and threw handfuls of it into everything he cooked. We even had curried porridge one morning. One day we met an old bloke who had a small sheep run in a remote bay where everything was taken in and out by launch. He was as deaf as a post, and a real old bachelor. He lived in a shack that he and his brother had built from timber they'd pit sawn themselves 30 years before, and he must have had his old woolen singlet on nearly as long, for the hairs on his chest grew out through the cloth. He took us in for a brew, and his hut stank so badly from mold and stale food that Jock took his mug of black tea outside and drank it in the fresh air. Not wishing to offend the old chap, I stayed in the kitchen with him for nearly an hour, suffering the stench of filthy clothing and decay, though I found it impossible to accept the slice of bread and golden syrup he offered me. We promised to bring him a pig if we got a good one handy, and left him picking his nose on the doorstep. "The old coot's mad," said Jock indignantly. "Did you get a look at his eyes? Looked as if he was just going to knife us or something." While I didn't entirely agree with Jock, I wasn't ever going to spend a night with the old boy if I could possibly avoid it. A night in that stinking hut would finish anyone off, even if the owner didn't. His eyes were a bit queer-looking at that, piercingly blue and sunk well back under straggly eyebrows. He hadn't seemed at all deaf towards the end either. A real creepy sort of bloke. We used 4 huts altogether that season, and worked from each of them in turn. 3 of them were ordinary, nondescript shacks, of 1 room with a fireplace at one end and bunks, a table and old boxes for seats around the walls. The 4th was an abandoned farmhouse with a big orchard and a mob of wild turkeys wandering round in the scrub behind. On fine nights you could see from the front window the lights of a town on the other side of the gulf. There were some oars and an old leaky dinghy in the boat shed, which we used for fishing excursions on Sundays, though the continuous bailing we had to do to keep the outfit afloat detracted considerably from our enjoyment. One morning Jock came dashing breathless into the hut, and said to grab my rifle and come with him. On the way up the track he told me he'd found 4 big pigs feeding in an old quarry, the only entrance to which was about 10 feet wide. He led me to this cutting from which we could see the pigs, one of them a big boar, rooting among some fern in the bottom of the quarry. We took aim from each side of the cutting and fired together, dropping the big boar and 1 sow. The other 2 bolted straight for the entrance, and Jock leapt into the middle of the opening and waved and shouted to chase them back. They didn't swerve from their course, and one of them, a hefty young boar, collided with Jock, bowled him on the stony ground, bit his hand, and shot into the scrub behind its mates. Jock was bruised and cut from contact with the sharp stones, and his hand was pretty badly torn, but he still had a bit of fight left in him. "Let the dogs go," he yelled. "We'll stop him before he gets into the bush. He's not getting off that easy." The dogs being tied up at the hut half a mile away, Jock's idea wasn't as flawless as it sounded, but he was compensated for his injuries by getting a good set of tusks from the big boar he'd shot. We went back to the hut for a camera, and I photographed Jock sitting wounded but victorious on the carcass of the boar, with the other lying in the background. I bet Jock's told some wonderful stories, with that photo for undeniable evidence of how he had a bare-handed fight with a savage boar on the Coromandel coast. Many of the goats we were trying to clean out took to the cliffs, where it was hard to get at them. We tried picking them off from the sea, but the surge rocked the boat too much for accurate shooting, and we used a lot of ammunition finishing off the occasional one that was only wounded and swam around in the surf after it fell. We went ashore once or twice and cleaned up small mobs, but the steep, rocky nature of the coast made safe landing in most places impossible. By the end of our first month's hunting, we had 140 goats and 30 pigs each, not to mention the dozens of snapper, kahawai, and other fish we caught from the rocks and the boat. I'd found an old but serviceable crayfish pot under some junk in the boat shed, and every time we dumped it overboard, we got 2 or 3 crays in it. Jock shot a big kingfish from the boat one day, and we had fish and chips for tea. There were plenty of mussels, sea eggs, and oysters on the rocks, and with the stray sheep or two discreetly obtained, and roast wild turkey, we ate like lords all the time we were there. Jock, who'd been to sea at some time, managed to patch up the dinghy so we could go farther afield in it without fear of sinking. We often rowed from one bay to the other with all the dogs on board, when the weather was calm enough, in case we got a chance to round up some goats where we could get ashore. The dogs weren't good sailors, and didn't like the boat at all. It sometimes took as long as an hour to drag them all from hiding and tie them to the seats. They used to jump overboard and try to swim to shore until we got the idea of tying them in. Whenever we started loading the boat, there wasn't a dog to be seen anywhere. They'd be making themselves scarce under the hut or behind logs and trees. The weather was pretty good to us that winter, and apart from a few days of rain and a storm or two, we suffered no great discomfort. Jock discovered that the old bloke with the stinking hut had a supply of wine with which he was very generous, so we decided he wasn't such a formidable character after all, and took him large and frequent loads of meat. It was far more than he could ever possibly have eaten, but he shared 2 or 3 bottles of plonk with us on each visit. Once, when we'd stayed rather longer than usual, we made 4 unsuccessful attempts at getting our boat full of dogs out through the surf from his beach, and the ill-guided vessel eventually turned broadside on and capsized. The yowling tangle of frightened dogs almost drowned our cursing abuse as we accused each other of being drunk, untangled the dogs, and salvaged our rifles and gear from the water. We ended up roaring with laughter on the beach, while the dogs bolted for shelter beneath the old bloke's hut. By the time we'd washed all the sand out of our rifles and dried everything over a fire, caught all the dogs, and refused the old bloke's offer of more wine to warm us up, we were in a much better condition to put to sea. We got away this time without shipping a drop of water, but the dogs made it plain that they'd lost all faith in us when it came to handling a boat. Jock had made the mistake of bringing only one pair of shorts on to the block with him, and by this time they were in a rather bad state of repair. The stitching had rotted due to the fact that they had never been washed, and they had come apart so completely that they hung round his waist like a greasy ragged skirt, held together only by the piece of rope he used for a belt. Since we slept in our clothes, it wasn't necessary for Jock ever to remove this garment, and it came to be part of him with a permanence that only the frail nature of the cloth was going to terminate. The approach of a boat or a group of trampers would of course send Jock diving modestly into the scrub, until I'd ascertained whether there were any women in the party. If there were, he remained where he was, while I explained that he was shy of strangers, and they went on their way. If there were only men, I'd call him, and he'd come sheepishly from behind a bush or rock, holding his trousers together in one or two of the worst places. One day, when we were waiting for the dogs in a clearing above the homestead, a party of 18 or 20 trampers, half of them girls, suddenly appeared round the side of the hill. The nearest cover was about 40 yards away, and Jock gurgled miserably as he saw the predicament his vestigial clothing had landed him in. He leapt up with the idea of making for the bush, but realizing it was too late, sat down again with his picow, in which he had a freshly slain leg of pork, strategically placed in his lap. Pleading a sprained ankle, Jock shook hands with all the trampers, male and female, from a sitting position on the ground, where he was trapped until they chose to carry on their way. Someone suggested that we move to the edge of the bush and swing a brewbilly, so Jock said he'd come over as soon as he'd taken off his boot and had a look at his bad ankle. To his utter despair, one of the women, who had been a nurse or something, insisted on having a look at it, and instructed two of the men to carry the now frantic Jock across to the fire. The only thing that saved him was his filthy appearance, and the fact that blood from the leg of pork in his picow had leaked all over his legs. The nurse removed the boot and remains of dirty sock, pronounced the injury not serious, and said Jock should be assisted down to the hut before swelling started. I managed to convince the matronly soul that Jock wasn't in desperate need of her assistance, and would make his own way down to the hut after he'd rested for a while. I also informed her it was almost a weekly occurrence. I learned from Jock later that he'd told her it was the first time he'd sprained an ankle in his life. Poor Jock sat wretchedly in the middle of the clearing for 3/4 of an hour, making weak excuses for his strange behavior and hugging his picao as though afraid it was going to melt. Some of the girls took him a mug of tea and some biscuits and stood round him chatting sympathetically about the discomforts of a sprained ankle and the various treatments and cures for them. Jock fumbled clumsily, with the tea and biscuits in one hand and the picao in the other. Several minutes of his contradictory jabbering convinced them of his insanity, and they left him to come over and ask me how long he'd been like that. Did I think I could manage him on my own? I explained that it was all the people around that upset him, and was offered assistance and advice for his control. Jock looked real unhappy, sitting out there with a crowd of strangers milling about, sneaking furtive glances at him, and murmuring among themselves. When at last the trampers packed their gear and swung off down the track, Jock asked anxiously if I thought they'd noticed anything. I lied as convincingly as I could, but that night Jock patched his pants by poking holes with his knife and lacing them together with string. It was still a far from adequate garment, and it wasn't long before he was forced to cut the legs off his good suit trousers and use them for hunting in. He complained bitterly as he did so that the country was bloody well overpopulated. Within 2 weeks his new shorts were as ragged as the old ones. The hunting had been so good that we knew it couldn't last. The goats were all in the open along the cliffs, and the pigs had only the bush and scrub in the gullies, and along the top of the ridge for shelter. There was nowhere from them to escape to. The peninsula was separated from the ranges by miles of farmland, and most of the beasts the dogs missed we shot as they ran into the open. At the end of 2 months, we'd whittled them down to the point where we were only getting 1 or 2 goats and a stray pig in a full day's hunting. Jim, when he came with supplies, or to see how we were getting on, had trouble picking up a bit of pork, and that with all his dogs on the go. The place was cleaned out. We'd had a lot of fun with all the fishing, and the old bloke and his free wine, but with nothing left for us to hunt, Jim decided to move us to a block down the coast, to spend the last month of the season building a hut. We stayed overnight in the Flatbush pub on our way to the new block and had a session. With a few beers under his belt, the taciturn Jim became really expansive and told us some terrific yarns about hunting and fishing. He'd been around a bit. Our Jim had. I began to see, too, why he'd become a bit of a skeptic about shooters. Between the 5th and 6th beers, he told us an old lady had come into his office a week or 2 before waving a letter from her son, a shooter in the Kaimanawas. Jim was neglecting her Ralph, and here was Ralph's letter to prove it. It was a grim story. Ralph starving for days in snow-bound caves. Ralph trapped on icy ledges, hundreds of feet above cruel, rocky gorges. Ralph being dragged helplessly down raging snow-fed torrents. As he wrote, Ralph lay on the verge of death in a leaking hut, wounded and bleeding after being gored by a savage stag, lying for 2 days in the snow, and then crawling through a blizzard to the frigid shelter of the hut. It had taken Jim a long time to convince Ralph's worried mother that her boy's imagination was working overtime, that there had been just one light snowfall in the Kaimanawas this autumn, that there had been little rain, that the stags had all shed their antlers for the year, and that Ralph was assuredly fit enough to have posted a letter. As soon as Ralph's mom had gone, Jim had telegraphed the field officer in charge of the Kaimanawas just to check. The reply told all. Ralph had been caught in a pub at Taihop when the day book said he was hunting on his block. He had been sacked 2 weeks before, in the best of health. About the 11th beer, something reminded Jim of another character, who made Ralph seem like George Washington. Jim's speech was getting pretty colorful by this time, but minus 1 or 2 of his favorite words. This is what he told us. I was shooting with a bloke called Ron something or other in South Westland just after the war. Biggest lying coot I ever come across. If he told you the billy was boiling, you could bet 50 rounds it wasn't. If he said the river was flooded, you'd know it was low enough to cross without getting a boot full. Only good thing about him was he lied all the time. You could count on it. The one time he went up to the tops, he got himself lost and didn't get back till next day. Said he'd been floundering around in a blizzard and almost collided with an enormous stag. He'd shot it, skinned it, and warmed his hands on the body. When it got dark, he'd gutted the deer, wrapped himself in the skin, and crawled inside the carcass out of the weather. In the morning, he'd found himself buried in 3 feet of snow, and the carcass frozen solid. His knife was outside, and his hands were too numb anyway to bend the flaps back. He was trapped. By the time he'd chewed himself free, climbed down to the river, and got swept under a log jam, it was late in the afternoon. He'd swum up through the logs, shifting them aside as he came to the surface for air, dived again for his rifle and pack, and then gone off for the evening shoot. He'd cleaned up a mob of 25 deer, but lost all the tails at his last river crossing on the way back to camp. I found the place later on where he'd spent the night and most of the next day in his sleeping bag, about 20 minutes upriver from the hut. Later on he took our pack horse up the river flats to get a bundle of skins we'd left behind. tied the nag up, and went out for a shot. Got nothing. Came back, saw the horse through the trees, and dropped it for a deer. Story he told me was the beast went mad and attacked him, so he had to shoot it in self-defense. I said the horse's body was still tied to the tree, and it looked to me as if it had been shot from the side. He had the cheek to say he'd tied it up after it was dead to stop the pigs from dragging it away with our pack saddle. The hole in the horse's shoulder was where the bullet had come out. It had gone in its mouth. I booted him off the block for pointing his rifle at me in the finish, and I wasn't too sorry for the chance when I got it either. That wasn't the finish, though. A few days later, a crowd of police came in to get me, armed to the teeth. My mate had been spouting in a pub about how I'd been blazing away at him for 2 days, riddling the hut with bullets, and just missing doing him a serious injury. He'd crept out in the night and run for safety, followed by a screaming hail of 303s. Someone had heard this yarn, told the police, and they'd come to get me. It took a while explaining about our run, and by the time they got back to town, it was too late. He'd done a moonlight on the publican, owing a week's board and wearing the barman's shoes and coat. Don't know where he got to, but he was a beaut. Next morning Jim discussed the building of the hut with his usual reserve and taciturnity. The hut was to be built in a clearing 2 hours in off the Wyora Road. We packed a cross-cut saw, maul, and wedges, blasting powder, axes, and all the gear from a camp into the site on a lazy old pack horse Jim borrowed from a cocky up the road. He gave us a hand with the camp frame, then returned to town saying he'd bring the malthoid and nails in a week or so. Meanwhile, Jock and I were to knock over a suitable tree and split it into boards. He wrote the measurements in the back of the day book. We sorted out a tall, straight totara and spent a whole day and an hour after dark felling it. The front of the saw was nearly as blunt as the back, and it took us 2 hours to sharpen it with a big, awkward file we'd brought for sharpening the axes. Jock filed the teeth on one side, and I did the other. One of us must have done it wrong, because the saw always cut on an angle after that. Next day we sawed the log into lengths, and knocked off early with aching backs and blistered hands. We bored holes in the ends of the lengths we'd cut the log in two, and tamped blasting powder and fuse into them. There was too much powder in the first charge, and the explosion shattered the log into nice handy lengths for firewood. The other lengths all split cleanly into halves, and the rest was easy. With maul and wedges, we split the timber into boards and trimmed them with the axes. Our clearing was 300 yards long and about 50 across. Two small streams merged in a pool near where we were building the hut, and wound on down through the clearing to join at the bottom with a small river. All around was heavy native bush, with one patch of fern, and second growth where, years before, someone had cleared a few acres on the ridge opposite. There were barely enough deer there to keep us in meat, but you could get yourself a skinny pig any time you wanted. Possums were there in hundreds. We had to put all the food in boxes at night, or they'd get into it and either eat it or tear open the packets and bags and scatter them all over the clearing. They'd also climb on the tent and scrabble round till we punched them off from the inside or swiped them with a rifle butt. One night I had a shot at one that was squawking on the ridge pole, keeping us awake. I got the possum all right, but the blast of the rifle at such close range blew a long rip in the tent just over my bunk. I hung a sleeping bag cover over the hole, but the possums kept pulling it off, so I wired it into place, and the rain leaked onto my bunk through the holes I'd poked with the wire. Then I hung a deer skin over the cover and tied a dog at each corner of the tent. This had the possums properly bluffed until they got the idea of dropping onto the tent from an overhanging tree. We couldn't win. By the time Jim arrived, with the rolls of maltoid, nails, and odd bits of gear, we'd piled enough boards and poles on the site to do the whole job, and had put in 2 days cleaning up a few overgrown places on the track. Jim wasn't very happy about the hole in the tent, and asked what we wanted shooting around the camp like that. Why didn't we clobber the possums with a stick? And what was the idea of tying the dogs so close to the camp, with dirty old bones lying round near the food? Jim was the sort of bloke who never raised his voice to tell you off about something, but a few words of his quiet reproach were more to be feared than a solid half-hour of healthy abuse. Once he'd had his say, he forgot about the matter and went on as if nothing had happened. Made you feel a proper goat sometimes. But he'd always listen to what you had to say before he went crook, and admitted when he was wrong himself. And Jim never came into a camp without a spare packet of tobacco, in case the blokes were running short, or a fresh cabbage, or a few books, or even a bottle of beer. We'd made a slight miscalculation in measuring the logs, with the result that the hut was a few inches smaller each way than it was supposed to be. Jim said it was something to do with the way the saw teeth were set, and altered the plan to suit the shortest boards. We erected a strong frame, and nailed the boards into place, using the backs of the axes for hammers, cutting the timbers with a blunt hand saw, and fitting them round the door and chimney, and bunks took as much time as the rest of the hut. Most of the difficult parts were left to Jim, who wasn't a bad carpenter. When all the boards were on, we covered the whole structure with multhoid and tacked it into place. We lined the chimney with stones and built up the fireplace with earth so you didn't have to stoop to get at the billies. Then Jim fitted a door while Jock and I cut a hole for a window because the place was too dark. We finished the job 3 weeks and 2 days after we'd started, and called it Digger's Hut, after one of Jock's dogs who'd moved into residence before the frame was finished, and had to be evicted several times daily for getting in the way. The season ended a week later, and Jock created quite a diversion at the nearest spot of civilization before gaining the sanctuary of a clothing store, where he could shout himself a pair of trousers. We climbed out of the truck at the edge of town, and Jock nipped into the phone booth to ring a taxi so he wouldn't have to walk up the street in the last tatters of his pants. A minute later, he poked his head out again and said they'd taken the handle off the phone. "There's a notice about pennies in the slot," he said indignantly. "What the hell do they think this is? A public lavatory?" Between us, we worked out how to make the phone call and got a car sent round. The driver wouldn't let us put the dogs in his car, and when I said I'd walk in with them, he said I might as well put my mate on the chain and lead him too. He reckoned he couldn't expect humans to use his cab after Jock. Jock did his bun properly. "So, my money's not good enough, eh, mate?" he snarled at the driver, who was getting ready to take off. "It's not your money," said the driver. "It's your pockets. They've got no pants in them." He let in the clutch quickly, and the cab leapt away. A bus was out of the question, the way Jock was fixed, so we walked into town, Jock walking slightly northeast of me in a futile attempt to make himself inconspicuous. The spectacle he made scuttling, blushing up the street in search of a rag shop, in a nice neat coat and a pair of filthy tattered trousers cut off above the knees, is one few who saw it are likely to forget. As often happens with blokes you shoot with, I never saw Jock again. There were rumors that he'd gone to Australia, that he was back at sea, that he'd gone on the booze and ended up on the island, that he was in jail, that he'd been killed in an accident, that he was shooting a block on the west coast, that he was working in a circus, that he'd gone south and married a publican's daughter, that he'd bought a used car business, an orchard, a fishing boat, a poultry farm, a shop, and several other unlikely objects. Jock was a very busy lad. I hunt the Cocky's pigs with Jim. "Sit down if you can clear yourself a place, Crumpy," said Jim. "I suppose you've come to see about lining up a block for the summer, eh?" It was just over a week since Jock and I had finished the hut in the Rockatory, and I'd been hanging round the town, wasting money and looking for someone to talk to. Jock had headed south on the train, and most of the other blokes had gone home to see their folks. The only other shooter left in town was a bloke who'd come in off the track. Jock and I had started in the Rahines the winter before, but he was so tied up with a Maori girl from the cafe that he had no time for his mates. Somehow the idea of going to see my family and answering a lot of stupid questions hadn't appealed to me. My mother's letters had been hinting that it was high time I came home and settled into a good steady job. At last, in desperation, I'd gone to see Jim about a good dear block for next season. Anyway, he might just have a bit of work sorting out gear in the storeroom, or something, anything. How would a job at Waikaremona suit you, Crumpy? All the traveling is done in a boat with an outboard motor. Huts all round the lake edge. No camping unless you want to. The blokes have been getting over 500 deer a season there for the past 3 or 4 years, and there are more moving through from the Waiau Valley all the time. Good, easy country too. How does she sound to you? Fair enough, Jim, I said. Wouldn't mind having a lash at it. When does the season start? Like that, is it? He said, grinning at me. It'll be just over 2 weeks before we've got everything ready. Could you use a few days' work in the meantime? Yeah, I suppose so. Nothing much to do. Well, let's see. There's a half-hour tourist track needs cutting from the road in to the head of the Mokau River. There's a hut needs fixing at the Hawaro summit. Still a fair bit of snow around up there. There's about 100,000 rounds of ammunition that needs counting into boxes. And oh yes, they want men at Pongakawa. They're planting a 4,000-acre block in young pines. Oh, I said, wondering whether a spell in town might have been better after all. None of them was the sort of job I'd had in mind. That's about all we've got, Crumpy, except that a cocky up at Whitianga wants us to have a lash at a pig that's been coming out of the bush and cleaning up his lambs. This is apparently the 3rd or 4th year he's been at it, and the old boy's getting a bit annoyed. Do you think you could handle that one? Sounds more like it, Jim, I said. That job will suit me. Okay then, I'll put you on wages for a fortnight. I'd better run you up there tomorrow, and we'll have a look at the country. This bloke doesn't want us using dogs, or shooting round his lambing ewes, and it might be a bit awkward. The cocky had a sheep run in the foothills of the Coromandel Ranges. His place was spread against one side of a leading ridge, along the top of which was the bush line, with his boundary fence hard against the bush. He reckoned the wild boar a big black beggar he called the man-eater had cleaned up a bloke who'd dropped dead of a heart attack while working on the boundary fence 5 years before. The brute was coming out at night and waiting among the sheep till one of them dropped a lamb. Then he'd nip in and eat it before it even got to its feet. There was a rumor, the cocky said, that the same pig had killed and eaten a dog that a farmer farther along the range had tied to a fence at the bush line to keep the pigs back. It sounded as if this bloke was getting carried away with the idea of having a carnivorous pig on the place. We came to the conclusion that he was a considerable liar. We had a look along the bush, on the ridge, while the cocky reckoned the boar came through from a valley on the other side. There was plenty of pig sign about, all right, but we found no marks anywhere near the size of this alleged man-eater. None of the places where pigs had pushed through holes in the fence had been used by anything above average size. Both Jim and I were of the opinion that it was probably a slab-sided old sow doing all the damage, or perhaps 2 or 3 of them. We camped in a hollow near the top of the ridge, and watched small mobs of pigs come out of the bush in the dusk. There was nothing very terrifying about any of them. A few skinny sows, with their young, and the odd razor-backed boar, unless the man-eater had a long way to travel, or only came out well after dark. He must have been on holiday. We left the pigs alone for the time being, and sat round the fire telling yarns about pigs and pig dogs, till it was time to hit the sack. Next day we drove down to the local store for a sack of spuds and a box of detonators, booking them up to the cocky, whose man-eating pig we were after. Then we spent a few hours hunting in a valley beyond the end of the road. Jim's dogs were really good to hunt with. They never left his heels until he told them to, and when they got something bailed up he wandered slowly towards them, discussing such things as soil erosion and bush regeneration. It was all I could do to restrain myself from dashing madly off through the bush towards the pig. But not once did the pig move from where Jim's dogs first bailed him, and we stopped 2 fairly big boars that day too. I was glad I hadn't brought Flynn with me. Beside these efficient dogs of Jim's, he'd have looked like a clumsy amateur. A dog's no good to me if he can't keep a pig busy till I get there, said Jim. He went in and killed both boars with the same short-handled slasher he carried everywhere. I would have stood off and waited my chance to shoot them, but Jim didn't appear even to consider that. He just waited until the pig had swung round towards one of the dogs, and slipped in for a quick cut across the back of the neck. A dog's not much good if he can't give me a chance to use the old slasher, he explained. Saves carting a rifle round with you. Ever get a pig have a go at you, I asked. Once or twice, Crumpy, he said. They're not hard to get out of the way of, and a boot in the head will usually knock them back if they're coming slow. It's when you get downhill from the dogs, or panic and try to run away, that you get caught. Saw a bloke once get his calf just about ripped off his leg running away from a boar. If he'd stayed where he was and belted it in the chops with his rifle, he'd have been all right. I had my slasher handy at the time, but this bloke ran as soon as the pig looked at him, and I never got a chance to use it. The boar bowled him and went up his leg like a sewing machine before I got there, and dragged him off. Good big pig it was too, worth getting. Much as I would have liked to, I couldn't see eye to eye with Jim on the matter of going in on bailed boars with a slasher. Lacking his dogs and his knowledge of pigs, I was content with standing off a modest distance, the farther away the better, and shooting. That afternoon we returned to our camp on the ridge, and laid a third of the bag of spuds along the bush line to bait the pigs. Next morning there wasn't a spud left. They'd cleaned up the lot, plus 4 more of the cocky's lambs. "These pigs are starved," said Jim, as we examined the remains of a lamb in the gully. "A pig's got to be pretty hungry before he'll come at this sort of thing. It's half the fault of the farmers anyway. They keep the private hunters out until too many pigs have bred. They get this, then they come screaming to us about it." Jim spent the day in the cocky's wool shed, doing some book work he'd brought with him, while I straightened the canopy frame of the truck in the smithy. We'd clipped the bank when a stray horse had forced us off the road on the way up, and the department was always a bit suspicious of the causes of dented vehicles. "They've got a booze complex," explained Jim. In the afternoon I went up to the bush line and laid another third of a bag of spuds for the pigs. The cocky asked us what the hell was the idea of booking up spuds and stuff at the store, so Jim told him that if he wanted to stop pigs eating his lambs without the use of rifles or dogs, he must feed them properly. The cocky's screams were almost human. It was some time before he cooled down and stalked off, muttering something about hearing more of this. "I don't think that the bloke appreciates what we are doing for him," grinned Jim. Next day we took the remaining spuds and the detonators up to the bush line. All the spuds I'd laid the day before had gone, and 3 lambless ewes bleated in the gully. We dug holes in 35 potatoes and carefully inserted a detonator in each, then laid them along the top of the ridge. "If this doesn't work," said Jim, "we're going to look just a bit silly." We spent the afternoon hunting a ridge that ran down into the bush valley. We got a boar, a sow, and 3 small suckers for our 4 hours hunting. All were lean and lousy, with very little fight in them. On our way back to camp, Jim expressed the opinion that what the area needed was a good spreading of phosphorus to poison all the mongrel pigs. Suggesting such a thing to our cocky friend would of course be a waste of time. He was even worse than the average small run holder. The blokes on the big stations in the high country are a different breed altogether, not to be confused with these moaners on the mudflats. It was barely dark that night when we heard the first dull whoomph from along the ridge. "There's one pig that won't come back for another dose," said Jim. "I hope the noise doesn't scare all the others away." But there was another thud, and another soon after that. We'd heard 19 of them before we went to sleep. The pigs that had been eating the spuds for the past 2 nights were chewing into the detonators and getting their heads blown open. Jim said he and another bloke had once got 70 in a night by this method. That was down south, where the pigs were destroying crops and rooting up the pasture to such an extent they were ruining 1 or 2 of the farmers. I thought of Harry and his deer-killing bomb, and wished he could have been present to see this. Next morning we walked along the ridge and counted 26 pigs lying dead, allowing for the detonators that had been swallowed without being chewed. Jim reckoned we'd got as many as we could reasonably expect. All the spuds were gone, and he said we'd probably find most of the missing detonators in the stomachs of some of the dead pigs, which turned out to be the case. A sheep we'd killed by mistake was discreetly disposed of in the bush. We went down to the homestead and invited old Scrooge up to examine the stomach contents of the dead pigs to see if any of them had been eating lambs. He came grudgingly enough, and almost went back again when he saw that we hadn't nailed his man-eater. Jim made him watch while we opened up each of the 26 pigs. 4 of them, 3 sows, and a weedy old boar, showed obvious signs of having been at the sheep. The cocky said fair enough, but what were we going to do about all the carcasses in his paddock? "Exactly the same as you did about the carcass in your paddock before we came here," said Jim. "Nothing." Without a word of acknowledgement, thanks, or goodbye, the cocky turned and left us on the ridge. "You know, Crumpy, I don't think that bloke's very fond of us, do you?" "Oh, it's just his manner, Jim," I said. "Beneath it all, he's probably got a heart of gold." "Well, we can be pretty sure we've got the pigs we wanted," said Jim, "but in a few weeks' time another lot will have moved in, and the whole thing will start again, until we got some real cooperation from these near-sighted cockies. The complete eradication of noxious animals in places like this will be impossible. I'd sooner try and talk sense to one of my dogs than to a bloke like that." We loaded all our stuff into the truck and drove to the nearest pub for a beer before going back to the office. It took us 3 days to cover the 160 miles. The beer tasted good when Jim was there to drink it with. Back at the office we found 3 letters of complaint from our cocky friend on Jim's desk. Jim handled all that sort of thing. The first letter was dated the day after we'd got there, and said that 2 men had arrived and had been seen going into the bush some miles away from his place, with 5 dogs and a gun. Were they supposed to be doing this? The second letter, dated a day later, demanded restitution for 1 large sack of potatoes and 3 dozen detonators, which these men had ordered from a store at his expense to feed the pigs with. The department had no right to send such inexperienced men to work among his valuable stock, and if he didn't get some satisfaction, he was going higher up. The third letter threatened police action against the department, a civil case against the parties responsible for littering his property with carcasses, and an inquiry into the criminal waste of public funds. An abusive postscript was scrawled on the bottom of the letter in shaky handwriting. Jim answered all 3 letters with a few polite sentences, reminding the outraged citizen of the penalty for sending obscene and threatening letters through Her Majesty's mails. I meet legs. I spent a week counting ammunition in Jim's storeroom and replacing broken axe and slasher handles before buying myself a bit of gear and thumbing a ride towards my dear block at Lake Waikaramona. Jim had said he was putting a good, keen man with me, which if true could be pretty rotten luck. I'd probably have to poach on every other block in the area if he really was good and keen. This new mate, who kept me waiting for 3 days in the Hopperahine base hut, was called Frank Miller. He got off a timber truck at the Public Works camp and staggered down to the hut under the weight of 2 pairs of pajamas, a huge oilskin raincoat, gum boots, still covered with dung and dried milk from the cow shed, a roll of blue toilet paper, and other new shooter-type garbage. He even had underpants, long underpants, and in keeping with the rest of his gear, he carried all his stuff in a sack that had Tomoana calf pellets printed on it. I didn't go much on the look of him from the start. He sloped into the hut, sprawled his carcass on my bunk, and dug into my packet of tobacco before he even said good day. I didn't really blame him for not talking, though. You'd have sworn that another ounce in his 30-pound load would have buckled his incredibly skinny legs outwards at the knees. He had ginger hair, pimples, an enormous Adam's apple, and a voice which sounded like the pair of paradise ducks in the bay below the hut. Jim had given me a fairly clear idea where the various huts and tracks were, and instructions to show the new bloke over the block. This I wasn't looking forward to, after he'd kept me awake half the night telling me about the 4 sisters he'd left back on the farm, and a horse called Melody, which he'd ridden to school on 6 years before. But next morning we loaded the boat and set off for Morrow Bay. The wind was coming from the south, and by the time we started, the lake was getting a bit rough. I didn't like the look of the sky either. The boat was leaking like a sieve, but The good, keen man didn't make a move to pick up the bailing tin floating at his feet. All he did was moan about the weather and the way he was being treated by everything. Halfway to morale, the weather really turned nasty, and everything was getting nicely soaked, when the outboard motor choked to death on a magneto full of water. It was all right, though. Wecka Legs knew all about outboard motors. He took out the spark plug and left it dangling over the stern on the end of the high-tension lead. I thought I heard something banging against the boat, but was too busy at the oars keeping us head-on to the waves to take much notice. Legs asked if we had another spark plug. I said no and kept on rowing. He poked around for another half hour before announcing that the plug had gone overboard. I was doubly delighted to learn that his hands were numb and that he had never rowed a boat in his life. By 9 o'clock that night, I had dragged the boat into the Moreau landing. In the meantime, Legs had been sitting on the back seat saying, "Look at me, I'm all wet," and similar brilliant things. It took us an hour to get all the gear up to the hut, where my intrepid mate promptly collapsed on the best bunk in an advanced state of exhaustion. I got a fire going with some wet manuka and a packet of candles and swung the billy. The rustling of the tea packet did what the chopping of wood on the doorstep had failed to do, and Legs moaned his way into consciousness, finding sufficient reserves of energy to wolf half a load of bread and most of the billy of tea. Then he moaned me to sleep. My first day in the company of Legs, and the prospect of spending the next 7 months with him, were not happy. Next morning I left him snoring in his bunk, and wandered out to see if I could pick up a few easy deer round the lake edge. I was just sneaking up on a hind and fawn that were feeding across the bay from the camp, when Legs came to the hut door and yelled that there were some deer behind the clump of scrub in front of me. I shot the hind as she reached the bush, and when she dropped I got the fawn, but it cost me 5 shots. I went back to the hut and made 1 or 2 observations on Legs' intelligence, as well as predicting his fate if he ever pulled a stunt like that again. I don't think he even knew he was being abused. He told me he got bad-tempered himself sometimes, especially when a cow put her foot in the bucket. For the next few weeks, I gave Legs most of the easy places to shoot, and was rewarded by his insisting that I was sending him up the lean creeks in order to shoot all the good country myself. He couldn't believe that the reason I was getting all the deer was because he spent more than half of his time in his sleeping bag. One wet day, to put his mind at rest, I took him with me over the main ridge and into the headwaters of the Monganuaha River, which was famous as one of the hungriest areas on the lake block. Legs complained all day as he thrashed along behind. Me, and still we got 14 deer. They must have been traveling, though, from somewhere else, for that day the place was lousy with them. Legs got 3, which was a record he never managed to break. After that, he often begged me to take him out again, but I couldn't bear the thought of it. I'd have got 20 that day if I'd been on my own. One morning, a passing fisherman called in for a brew of tea, and I put the acid on him for his spare spark plug. It cost us 2 legs of venison and 1 of pork. We'd been at Morale for more than a month, and deer were getting scarce, so with the boat usable again, we cruised round to Wapau Bay. The day was fine and the lake as smooth as grease, but 3 hours of Legs' inspiring conversation effectively spoilt the trip. We spent 3 weeks at the bay hunting up the Waipow River and over towards Warika Sheep Station, all heavy beech and tawa bush. Legs used 640 rounds of ammunition and won 17 deer tails. The wounded ones that just got away from him must have numbered at least 200. It surprised me that Legs ever saw a deer at all, for by this time I could smell him myself from several yards away, when the wind was right. The nearest he ever came to having a wash was when he slipped on a wet log at the mouth of the Waipawa. The only wood Legs ever brought into the camp was on the butt of his rifle. Every evening for some time I had been getting back to the hut just far enough ahead of Legs for me to get the fire going a feed on and the brew billy boiling by the time he arrived. It was getting beyond a joke, and I decided to wait in the bush one day and watch the hut to see what would happen. There was a perfect hiding place in some rocks on a low ridge opposite the hut, and one evening I went back early and circled round to the spot I had chosen. Legs and I saw each other at the same time. He'd found the lookout 2 weeks before I had. "Just having a smoke, Crumpy," he said. "Thought there might be a deer poking round up here," I said. We went down to the hut together, and that night Legs swung the T-billy. I picked a real dirty day for the trip back to the base, and Legs was beautifully wet and miserable when we got there. He caught me grinning and accused me of picking on him. After a few days on good grub, and in the company of the comparatively intellectual public works Maoris, who were camped at the road a mile away, I bailed our way round to Tapuna Bay, where I reckoned the deer would be feeding after spending the winter in the Hawarau Ranges. They weren't. I only got 4 deer in 3 days, and Legs wounded 1. We decided to cross to Waipoa and fly camp on the Wareka Station on the other side of the range. During the tramp across, Legs ruined our chances of getting the odd couple of deer you expect on the track by blazing away at fantails and bush robins, cacas, and bellbirds, with damage only to my temper and eardrums. His shooting was something terrible. I asked him if he could hit the lake if he was sitting in the boat, and he said he thought so. We slung the fly tent on the bush edge, and while I spent a few profitable days hunting the wareka, clearings, and creeks, Legs lay in his greasy sleeping bag, sucking at tins of condensed milk, and otherwise amusing himself. Whenever I referred to his disgusting personal habits, he'd say, "Garn, I left 'em because me sisters was always pickin' on me, and now you start." On the track back to Waipoa, he told me, in his loud, rasping voice, all about one of his sisters, who was training to be a herd tester, which again loused up our chances of getting a stray deer on the way. By this time, my good keen mate had become so repulsive to me that every evening in camp was an ordeal. He'd sit squarely in front of the fire, watching the billies boil over and squeezing his pimples with a faraway look on his face. I had never been particularly fond of him, and now I could hardly bring myself to eat in the same hut, despite the fact that I made no effort to conceal my dislike. Legs firmly believed that I held him in the highest regard. "Crumpy depends on me," he used to tell the blokes at the public works camp. This while I abused him daily and in detail for his revolting person and idiot behavior, when he ran the boat into a log looking at a trout and stove in the bow. My tolerance fell to an all-time low, to which the trip back to Hapuruahain gave the finishing touch. The man was impossible. He lay on the bow, trailing his arm over the side, while I frantically bailed with one hand and steered with the other. "Put the stuff on the seat," was his sleepy reply to my request that he bail out some of the water that was soaking our gear. If I hadn't been so busy, he'd have gone overboard, as sure as he lay snoring on the grub box. I was in a fairly antagonistic frame of mind when we finally reached the landing, where Legs, with characteristic cunning, suddenly developed severe cramps in his stomach and sneaked off up to the hut, leaving me to carry all the wet gear. Jim was at the hut when I got there, praise the Lord, and since he had already been subjected to 15 minutes of Legs' company, I got my way without too much trouble when I told him I'd throw in the job rather than condemn myself to another trip over the lake with Legs. Our good keen man's horrified look of persecution would have haunted for life a man who didn't know him, but that night I made a very deliberate entry in the day book. December 11th. F. Miller ceased duty. Next morning, with his calf pellet bag, his pimples, and the air of one who has been greatly wronged. Legs was committed to the company of the snarling tangle of dogs in the back of Jim's truck, and carried off to a shooter's training camp down south. Jim wouldn't let him ride in the front because he stank too much, and even the dogs looked a bit disgusted. I heard later that he went down the Nagaruro River with a bunch of new shooters. It happened to be in flood, which was nearly a great stroke of luck for humanity, for Legs, in order to demonstrate his superior bushcraft, plunged in calling for the others to follow. They fished him out some hundreds of yards downstream, but he was still alive. However, he threw in the job on the strength of this experience, which was an unlucky break for the deer. Before leaving with Legs, Jim told me he'd bring me a new mate in a few days' time. He had an experienced bloke in mind, a good keen man. I accepted this description with a few private reservations, and settled down, thankfully, on my own.